April 1968. A North Vietnamese prisoner is brought to American interrogators south of Khe Sanh. He tells them 3/4 of his regiment is gone, killed in a single raid. He never heard the aircraft. He never saw them. The men who survived found their dead in the open with no visible wounds, blood coming from their noses and mouths. Marines who walked the strike zone afterward sometimes found other survivors above ground, wandering, dazed. They had been killed by concussion. The bombers had flown above 30,000 feet, 3 aircraft in formation, each carrying 108 500-pound bombs. The Americans called the mission Arclight. From late January to early April 1968, 2,548 of these missions dropped 59,542 tons of ordnance around the Khe Sanh combat base. General William Westmoreland later said the thing that broke the back of the North Vietnamese Army at Khe Sanh was basically the fire of the B-52s. The North Vietnamese Army eventually learned to do something about it. This is the story of both. The Boeing B-52 Stratofortress had been designed for one job: drop a thermonuclear weapon on the Soviet Union. By the early 1960s, Strategic Air Command had built more than 700 of them and trained their crews exclusively for that mission. The aircraft cruised above the operating ceiling of most fighters. They carried hydrogen bombs. They sat on alert at air bases across the continental United States and held nuclear deterrence in their bomb bays. None of this was useful in South Vietnam. In 1964, the Air Force began training a small number of B-52F crews to drop conventional munitions. A year later came Project Big Belly, a modification program that converted the older B-52D into a heavy iron bomber. The standard nuclear payload was replaced by a heavy-density rack capable of carrying 84 500-pound bombs in the bomb bay and another 24 on underwing pylons. A modified B-52D could now drop 108 500-pound bombs in a single pass and lay them down in a pattern several thousand meters long. In February 1965, 30 B-52Fs flew the first Arclight mission out of Andersen Air Force Base on the island of Guam, 2,500 miles east of the Vietnam coast. The Joint Chiefs proposed striking North Vietnam with them. The State Department vetoed the proposal as too provocative. Strategic Air Command asked to bring the aircraft home. They were told to stay. For 4 months, the bombers sat on Guam doing nothing while military planners argued about what to do with them. The general who got them off the runway was William Westmoreland. He commanded American forces in Vietnam. He had watched tactical aircraft try and fail to break up Viet Cong jungle base camps in War Zone D north of Saigon. The base camps were dispersed, hidden under triple canopy, and impossible to find from the air on a strike-by-strike basis. Westmoreland argued that a B-52 cell could saturate an entire grid square at once, kill what was in it, and not need to find it first. On 18 June 1965, the argument was settled. 27 B-52Fs flew the first Arclight mission out of Andersen against a Viet Cong stronghold near Ben Cat, 40 miles north of Saigon. 2 of the bombers collided during pre-strike refueling. A third had to abort. The remaining aircraft dropped 750-pound and 1,000-pound bombs on the target box. Photo reconnaissance showed little. General William Westmoreland, commanding 7th Air Force in Saigon, called the tonnage being dropped on the South Vietnamese jungle appalling compared to the evidence of physical effect. Westmoreland disagreed. He said captured prisoners and defectors told him the same thing. Every time, enemy troops feared the B-52. In March 1966, a document captured by the 173rd Airborne Brigade during Operation Silver City II offered something close to confirmation. The annual report of the NVA Military Region 7 noted reluctance on the part of enemy units to remain in areas being struck by the heavy bombers. By mid-1967, Arclight was running at 800 sorties a month. During Operation Junction City in War Zone C, from February to May 1967, B-52s flew 126 sorties and dropped 4,723 tons of bombs. Of the 2,700 enemy dead counted at the close of the operation, Air Force analysts concluded that 75% had been killed by Arclight. By the end of 1967, the B-52 had become something specific. It was not, in Vietnam, a strategic weapon. It was an instrument of close air support, flown by Strategic Air Command crews on temporary duty from bases in the continental United States, directed onto its targets ground radar controllers using the AN/MSQ-77 Combat Skyspot system. The bombs left the bomb bay at altitudes above 30,000 feet. They fell to the ground in silence. The men in the target box, if they were above ground when the first one landed, did not know they were under attack until it landed. Then, in late January 1968, the People's Army of Vietnam decided to take Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh Combat Base sat on a plateau in northwestern Quang Tri Province, 14 miles south of the demilitarized zone and 6 miles from the Laotian border. The garrison belonged to the 26th Marine Regiment, reinforced under Colonel David E. Lowndes. The garrison numbered around 6,000 men. Beginning in early January, American intelligence tracked the movement of major North Vietnamese Army elements into the surrounding hills. The 304th, 320th, and 325th C divisions were identified, plus a regiment of the 324th. Total PAVN strength in the area was estimated at 20,000 and possibly higher. On the night of 20-21 January, the artillery barrage began. Westmoreland had been planning for this. The plan was called Operation Niagara. He chose the name himself, after the falls, to evoke an image of cascading shells and bombs. Niagara would direct the entire weight of available American air power onto a single 25-kilometer radius. 330 tactical fighter bombers, 60 B-52s, and 30 observation aircraft would operate over the base on an average day. The B-52s would do the killing. The mechanics were precise. The map around Khe Sanh was overlaid with a grid of rectangular boxes, each 1 kilometer wide by 2 kilometers long. 3 B-52s flying together in a cell at over 30,000 feet could blanket a single box in high explosives. On average, a fresh 3-plane cell arrived on station every 90 minutes. They were directed onto their assigned box by a ground radar controller using Combat Skyspot. At the calculated release point, the controller called the drop. Each aircraft released 108 bombs in sequence. The bombs fell in silence for nearly a minute, then detonated at a rate of roughly 2 explosions per second for the next 60. There was no warning on the ground. The aircraft were inaudible. The bombs themselves were inaudible until the first one detonated, and by then the rest of the pattern was already arriving. A Marine on Hill 881 South, watching from his perimeter, would see the ground rise in a wall of dust and debris, traveling in a straight line for over a mile. The overpressure wave would reach him at the perimeter several seconds later, hard enough to knock a man backward. The Marines learned to cheer the strikes. They were also, all of them, glad to be on the friendly side of them. For the PAVN, the experience was different. Soldiers were found after arc-light strikes wandering in the open, bleeding from the nose and mouth with no visible wounds. Their lungs had been ruptured by the concussion. The Marines at Khe Sanh learned to time their artillery to catch them. 10 to 15 minutes after the bombers departed, mortar and howitzer fire would land on the same coordinates. Stunned men above ground were caught by it. Men in shallow trenches were caught by it. Men in deep bunkers, if their bunkers withstood the bombs, were not. The combined sequence had a name in the Marine Fire Support Coordination Center. They called it the Mini Arclight. A smaller version, executed in 10 minutes with A-6 intruder aircraft and Army 175mm guns, was the Micro Arclight. On an average night at Khe Sanh, 3 or 4 minis and 6 or 8 micros were run. Westmoreland personally directed the B-52 sorties from the MACV Combat Operations Center in Saigon. He had top priority over the entire B-52 fleet in Southeast Asia. Aircraft came from Guam, from Utapao in Thailand, from Kadena on Okinawa. The sky over Khe Sanh in February resembled, by one Marine officer's description, a giant beehive. Bombers stacked in holding patterns up to 35,000 feet, corkscrewing downward as each cell delivered its ordnance and cleared out. The initial standoff distance for arclight strikes was set at 3,300 yards from the Marine perimeter. Colonel Lowndes wanted his men outside the danger arc of the 500-pound bombs. The PAVN learned to move closer than the standoff distance. A captured tactic used since Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and refined at Con Tien in 1967 was to attack American positions from trench lines dug to within a few hundred meters of the wire. The North Vietnamese called it grabbing the enemy by the belt. As long as they stayed close, the B-52s could not be brought in on top of them. General Momier fixed it. He demonstrated in late January that the Stratofortress could deliver an accurate pattern at 3/4 of a mile from friendly troops. Lowndes lifted the restriction. After that, arclights were called in within 1,000 meters of the Marine perimeter, occasionally closer. The PAVN's belt-grabbing tactic stopped working in the Khe Sanh battlefield. By the time the siege was lifted on April 8, 1968, the 2,548 arclight sorties dropped 59,540 tons of ordnance into the boxes around the base. Air power overall delivered nearly 100,000 tons of munitions. Marine and Army artillery added another 158,891 rounds. Westmoreland's Systems Analysis Office estimated PAVN casualties at between 9,800 and 13,000 men killed and seriously wounded. The lower figure was half of the force initially committed to the siege. The 26th Marines lost 274 killed and around 2,500 wounded. Westmoreland would later write that the battle was won by the officers and men of the 3rd Air Division. The thing that broke the back of the NVA, he said, was basically the fire of the B-52s. Inside the People's Army of Vietnam, the lessons of Khe Sanh were absorbed quickly. Captured directives later in 1968 and into 1969 ordered units operating in known B-52 strike corridors to disperse below regimental level. Battalion strength formations were broken into companies. Companies moved at night. Daytime movement was forbidden in the 3rd Corps free strike zones. Where dispersal was not possible, the response was depth. PAVN engineers built reinforced tunnel and bunker complexes specifically designed to survive a 500-pound bomb impact at close range. The bombs would still come. The men would be 20 feet underground when they did. There was also a second answer, and it had nothing to do with engineering. A North Vietnamese soldier captured in April 1968 told his interrogators that his unit was usually warned 2 hours before a B-52 strike. The warnings came by radio and by telephone. They were timely and accurate enough that the unit had time to clear the box. Where the warnings originated, he did not know. American counterintelligence eventually traced the leak. Soviet electronic intelligence trawlers stationed in international waters off Guam listened to the radio traffic from Andersen. The signature of a maximum effort launch was unmistakable. Long taxi lines, distinctive engine signatures, predictable refueling tracks. By correlating launch time with the standard transit to South Vietnam, Soviet analysts could pass warning to Hanoi with as much as 8 hours of notice. The National Security Agency repeatedly tried to tighten Andersen's communication practices. The leakage continued for the duration of the